Come, come, whomever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving, ours is no caravan of despair. Actually, the quote is here, even if you have broken your vows 1,000 times, come yet again, come. Ours is no caravan of despair. We will always have a word of good news on Sunday because we put our interdependence at the center of our story. So that when we know sorrow, may we also know kindness. I have to tell you, I recently took a terrifying leap into the post-pandemic world. I flew on an airplane. Double masked was I, armed with hand sanitizer and handy wipes, and at least a dozen tiny calculations to try and protect myself from COVID transmission as best I could. Well, it turned out, while my physical protection was top of mind, I had not prepared my spirit for what I was about to encounter. What I saw were 2 straight rows of about 200 people obsessing over their own personal comfort, like always. Their desire to have whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted it. People whose masks inched down their faces as the flight went on. People who chatted heartily as ever and made crass, loud, often sexist jokes as though we were not living through a mass death event. Maybe you too have had moments like this one of deep societal disappointment when your carefully constructed optimism and hope for humanity begins to crack a little here, then a little more over here, breaking into a wider fissure as the woman to my left turned towards me, pulled down her mask, and began to cough. I wish I could tell you it was an isolated event, that cough, but she spent the duration of the 3-hour flight repeating the gesture. After a time, I wondered if it was an aggressive reaction to my pretty visible paranoia, as I refused all drinks and snacks, spraying hand sanitizer on every available surface again and again, with my 2 masks checking to make sure they were sealed tight. I got to my feet and hung out at the back of the plane with the flight attendant until my hacking neighbor made her way also to the back of the plane to rejoin my airspace and use the restroom. We both returned to our seats. The coughing began again, and I strained my body in the opposite direction, like some kind of mime performance, for quite a while. In case you thought all my meditation practice, my study and prayer has elevated me to a higher moral plane of existence, I will tell you, I cycled through every angry comment I could imagine making, seething under my own helplessness and what was really fear, until somehow another idea struck. What if I was doing the same thing I judged everyone else for? In my fear, I was regarding only my obligation to my own health rather than the health of others. I remembered how sometimes my own children will cry over a small scratch until they have received enough loving care and motherly attention from me, and suddenly it doesn't hurt so much anymore. Which is to say, what if I tried empathy? So I turned to her and offered, "I've noticed you coughing quite a bit. Are you okay?" "Oh, I'm fine," she said. "It's just chronic. I've had this for years." "I hope it's not bothering you." At which point, my own blood pressure dropped considerably, and I stopped thinking that maybe she was aggressing me, and I settled in to enjoy the rest of the flight. Maybe the person sitting next to me was not out to get me after all. but how to live within the space between fearful suspicion and total trust. I mean, that's what we must do, isn't it? Find a way to make a home right there in that space between fearful suspicion and total trust. I mean, make our home there for the foreseeable future. Empathy. You don't wake up with it every day. It is something to be practiced, to practice, to rehearse. It is something doctors and nurses have been doing this entire pandemic. Thank goodness. Dr. Brittany Cobia, a hospitalist at the Grandview Medical Center in Birmingham, Alabama, was interviewed by the Associated Press during the height of the Delta variant spread in what was really ground zero in Alabama earlier this fall. She was asked about her feelings treating the unvaccinated patients as they struggled and often died of COVID under her care. She said, "You go into it thinking, okay, I'm not going to feel bad for this person because they make their own choice," Dr. Cobia said. But then you actually see them. You see them face to face. And it really changes your whole perspective because they're still just a person who thinks they made the best decision they could with the information they had and all the information that's out there, all the misinformation that's out there. And now, Dr. Cobia said, and now all you really see is their fear and their regret. And even though I may walk into that room thinking, okay, this is your fault, you did it to yourself, when I leave the room, I just see a person who's really suffering and who is so regretful of the choice they made. These doctors and nurses who treat the victim and the gunman, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, they do it because that is the oath they have taken. And it is simply what they do. And what of us, Unitarian Universalists? We continue to love people who may be hard to love, who may be misguided, who may be at times selfish. We continue the practice of empathy because as Universalists, well, that is what we do. That is the commitment we have made, the covenant we have made. And you've got to do when the Spirit says do, right? So it's time to take a page from disaster medicine. So get out your survivor's guide and begin to answer some of these questions. Who do you call when you are in crisis? Let's think about that. And how can you offer help to someone in need in your spiritual community? Search out and rescue each other. Be rescued. If you have some empathy, give some spiritual aid to give it generously, give it freely. One more story. A past parishioner of mine in New York City named David Fleener, Reverend David Fleener, is a chaplain at a New York City hospital. And in March of 2020, he, his stepdaughter, and his wife, also a chaplain, all contracted COVID. And his wife was very ill for quite a while. They were exhausted and afraid as New York was under siege at that time with 2,000 deaths a day on average. And as chaplains, they were at the center of the storm. David writes that after his recovery, he returned to work on site and found himself angry. Every little thing annoyed him. Back at the hospital, a teacher once told him that some people cover their anger with sadness. That some people cover their sadness with anger, while others cover their anger with sadness. Well, David knew in which group he belonged. He was grieving. And it was in that context that he received the voice message. As he walked through the hospital and his phone buzzed, he lamented how in an instant everything had changed. Workers had constructed new makeshift hospital rooms in the atrium. He was stunned out of his thoughts, his anger, when he felt his phone buzz in his pocket. He pulled it out, saw a friend's name, wanted to answer, but just didn't have it in him. With that realization, tears began to well up behind his eyes. He let it go to voicemail and continued walking angrily, tearfully on. A couple of hours later, he pulled out his phone and saw he had a voice message from his friend in Alabama. He had met Malcolm Marler 2 decades ago when training to become a hospital chaplain. One of America's first chaplains to serve in an outpatient clinic, Malcolm's ministry at that time was with Alabamans living with HIV and AIDS. Realizing how few patients he could reasonably care for on his own, he developed a support team program focusing on providing spiritual, emotional, and practical support to his patients who needed it. The program caught on like wildfire, and soon he was a nationally sought-after speaker. Years later, he would become the director of spiritual care at Alabama's top hospital. David looked up to Malcolm, had looked up to him for a long time, and considered him a professional role model and a friend. He pressed play and heard these words.
Hey, David, it's Malcolm Marler. I'm just giving you a call to let you know I am thinking about you, my friend, a lot. And you and Amy both. I just wanted you to know that. If you do not have time to return this call, I understand it, and it's not a problem. I just wanted you to know you're loved and that you're not alone. And I just want to give you some encouragement. Take good care. Bye-bye.
The voice message ended, and David wept. Those were precisely the words he needed to hear that day. Malcolm didn't burden David with a request. He didn't want anything. He just called to offer a word of encouragement, and it made all the difference. As David wept, he could feel weeks of fear, anguish, and rage release from his body. Sometimes 37 seconds is all it takes to throw someone a life raft, to search and rescue, to be found and rescued. I hope when you remember this time in our collective history and in your personal one, you remember the empathy as much as the fear. The times when people listened to one another instead of judging each other. When people served the common good with their choice to stay home or to stay masked. When we loved each other by maintaining physical distance from one another. We have known sorrow as the deepest thing inside. And in the face of that sorrow, we have practiced kindness as the other deepest thing. When we have sent someone a note or a message asking nothing of them, just letting them know they are loved and they are not alone. Activist and organizer Margaret Wheatley says, sane leadership is the unshakable faith in people's capacity to be generous, creative, and kind. It is the commitment to create the conditions for these capacities to blossom, protected from the external environment. It is the deep knowing that even in the most dire circumstances, more becomes possible as people engage together with compassion and discernment, self-determining their way forward. If you have found a community that gives you hope each Sunday, and peace on Monday, and learning on Tuesday, and connection on Wednesday, don't keep it for yourself. Let your friends know there is a community, a place where they can be found and rescued. Let those who are trying to engineer resilience, trying to adapt to a new world of constant disasters and multiple crises, all alone, let them know this community won't ask much, but it will give them a word of encouragement when they need it the most. I want to close with the words of Reverend Joan Javier Duval, who wrote, "Through the tumults of these days, we seek assurance. Help us, abiding mystery. Spirit, help us to hang on, to hold on when all is in question, when all is in doubt. Help us to stay firm to our own commitments and our own promises. Lead us back into connection, back into the bonds of humanity that help us to know each other as beloved." Amen.